Most Americans think supply chains are neutral. They're not. The moment they break, it's not Wall Street that feels it first. It's your grocery bill, your job, your retirement. And here's the part almost no one wants to admit. America didn't lose control of supply chains by accident. It walked into a trap. And China designed it. Right now, at this exact moment, 97% of antibiotics in your medicine cabinet trace back to one country. If that supply stops tomorrow, American hospitals have a 30-day buffer. Then it's triage. Let that sink in for a second. The pills you take for granted, the medications your kids need, the drugs that keep your parents alive, they all flow through a single point of control. And it's not in America. Now, before you dismiss this as another trade war headline, understand something fundamental. People think this is about tariffs. They think it's about trade wars, cheap labor, or politics. That's the noise. The real game is architecture. Because tariffs don't control supply chains. Whoever designs the system controls the outcome, and America doesn't own the system it depends on. That's not political spin. That's not conspiracy theory. That's the uncomfortable reality hiding behind every "Made in China" label, every delayed shipment, every chip shortage that crippled an industry overnight. Still think this is just about cheap labor? Let's be brutally clear about what we're actually talking about here. This isn't about manufacturing jobs moving overseas. That ship sailed decades ago. This is about something far more strategic, far more permanent, and far more dangerous. China doesn't just manufacture products, it manufactures dependencies. And there's a massive difference between those two things that most people completely miss. When you manufacture a product, you control one transaction. When you manufacture a dependency, you control the entire relationship. You control leverage. You control timing. You control options. And most critically, you control what happens when things go wrong. That's power. Real power. So let's break down exactly how deep this goes, because once you see the architecture, you can't unsee it. China controls the raw materials. Not just some of them. The critical ones, rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, graphite. These aren't luxury items. These are the building blocks of everything from the phone in your pocket, to the electric car in your driveway, to the missiles that defend your country. China produces over 70% of the world's rare earth elements. But here's what makes that number terrifying. It's not just about extraction. China controls 90% of the processing and refining. You can mine rare earths in other countries. Australia does it. The United States has deposits sitting in the ground. But you can't use them without processing facilities. And building those facilities takes a decade, costs billions, and requires expertise that's concentrated in one place, China. Now move one step further down the chain. Even if you source materials elsewhere, even if you somehow bypass the rare earth monopoly, you hit the next wall. Component manufacturing. The mid-tier suppliers that nobody thinks about until they're gone. Picture a factory floor in Ohio. State-of-the-art equipment. Skilled workers. American flags hanging from the rafters. But the specialized bearings in those machines, made in China, the control systems that run the robotics, Chinese components, the hydraulic fluids formulated to exact specifications, processed in China. Take semiconductor fabrication. Taiwan produces over 60% of the world's semiconductors and over 90% of the most advanced chips. But where do Taiwan's suppliers come from? Where do the materials for those chips get processed? Where are the specialized chemicals manufactured? China. The clean rooms might be in Taiwan, but the supply chain flows through China. The same pattern repeats across every single industry. Solar panels, batteries, medical equipment, consumer electronics. The final assembly might happen in Vietnam or Mexico or even back in America. But the components, the sub-assemblies, the specialized parts that make everything actually work, they come from a network that China spent 30 years building, subsidizing, and controlling. And then there's logistics. People forget that moving products is just as strategic as making them. China doesn't just control ports in China, it controls or influences ports across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even parts of Europe through its Belt and Road Initiative. It operates the shipping lines. It builds the infrastructure. It creates dependencies at every level of the transportation network. So even when production happens elsewhere, the routes still flow through systems where China has leverage, which means even when America reshores factories, even when politicians cut ribbons at grand openings of new manufacturing plants, the weakest link is still not American. And we missed it. Here's what that actually means in practice. Every shortage you've seen wasn't random. Every price spike wasn't just inflation. Remember standing in front of empty shelves where baby formula used to be? Remember paying $8 for a gallon of milk? Remember watching your retirement account bleed red because chip shortages killed automotive stocks? These were stress tests, and America failed more of them than people realize. The pandemic supply chain crisis wasn't just about lockdowns. It was about discovering in real time that we'd outsourced our survival. 97% of antibiotics, over 80% of active pharmaceutical ingredients from China and India, with India depending heavily on Chinese raw materials. Surgical masks, protective equipment, ventilators, all suddenly unavailable because the supply chain had a single point of failure. And that point wasn't in America. That's not efficiency. That's vulnerability. Or look at the automotive industry. A single chip shortage froze production across the entire sector. Factories sat idle. Workers got furloughed. Billions in revenue evaporated. Not because America couldn't build cars, because it couldn't source a $3 semiconductor. And here's the part that should terrify any strategic thinker. That wasn't even a hostile move. That was just normal supply and demand during a crisis. Imagine what happens when supply chains become a weapon, because here's the framework that explains everything. A country that doesn't control its supply chains, doesn't control its inflation, its jobs, or its leverage. Let me say that again. A country that doesn't control its supply chains, doesn't control its inflation, its jobs, or its leverage. You can have the best brands, you can have the most innovation, you can have the biggest consumer market in human history, but if you don't control the supply chain, you don't control your economic destiny. You're a price taker, not a price maker. You're vulnerable to decisions made in boardrooms and government offices thousands of miles away. And in a crisis, you're at the mercy of whoever does control the chain. Now let's talk about how we got here, because this didn't happen by accident. This was strategy versus efficiency. Jeff Bezos once warned that optimizing only for efficiency creates fragile systems. America optimized for speed and cost. China optimized for control and redundancy. And in a crisis, fragility loses. Every single time. American companies made rational decisions. Move production to the lowest cost supplier. Streamline inventory with just-in-time logistics. Focus on core competencies and outsource everything else. Every individual decision made perfect sense. The consulting firms backed it with PowerPoint presentations. The shareholders loved it. Quarterly earnings improved. Stock prices went up. Bonuses got paid. But strategy isn't about optimizing individual decisions. Strategy is about understanding how those decisions create systemic vulnerabilities that your competitors can exploit. And China understood this perfectly. While American companies competed on quarterly returns, China planned in decades. It didn't just offer cheap labor. It built entire industrial ecosystems. It subsidized upstream suppliers at a loss for years. It invested hundreds of billions in ports, rail networks, logistics infrastructure. It trained millions of engineers and technicians. It created industrial clusters where suppliers, manufacturers, and logistics providers existed within miles of each other, reducing lead times and increasing flexibility. And most importantly, it made itself indispensable at multiple levels simultaneously. You couldn't just move one factory, you'd have to rebuild an entire ecosystem. And the cost of doing that, the time required, the coordination needed, all of it made staying look rational. That's the trap. Let me give you a micro story that illustrates exactly how this plays out in the real world. A US manufacturer had everything going for them. Strong brand, valuable patents, growing market share. They were the American success story. The risk assessment teams focused on wages and shipping costs. Standard metrics. What the risk models completely missed was a $3 component, a specialized fastener. Nothing complex, just a bolt with a specific alloy and a particular heat treatment process. And that process existed in only one facility. In China. No one thought twice about it. Why would they? It was $3, it was reliable, it had never been a problem. Then trade tensions increased. The Chinese supplier got quiet pressure from their government. They didn't cut off supply. That would be too obvious, too provocative. They just slowed down. Quality issues emerged, lead times stretched from 2 weeks to 6 weeks to 12 weeks. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that would make Bloomberg headlines, but enough to create problems down the line. The American manufacturer tried to find alternatives. Turns out that specific alloy process was patented in China. The few facilities capable of producing it elsewhere were at full capacity serving existing clients. Waiting list measured in years. The $3 component became a bottleneck. Production didn't slow. It stopped. 6 months later, the company was in crisis mode burning cash. A year later, they were restructuring and taking loans. 18 months later, they sold to a competitor at a discount. All because of a $3 part that nobody thought was strategic. Power isn't owning the final product. Power is owning the choke point. Now here's where this gets really sophisticated, where the architecture becomes almost beautiful in its ruthlessness. China doesn't need to cut America off. That would cause backlash. It would unite opposition. It would accelerate efforts to reduce dependence. Wars get started over obvious aggression. Instead, the strategy is subtler and far more effective. They only need to remain indispensable. Because the trap isn't dependence. The trap is designed dependence. And once you're inside it, every move you make strengthens the trap. You want to diversify suppliers? They're already invested in the alternative countries. Vietnam, Thailand, Mexico, China's Belt and Road partners, they all have Chinese investment in their supply chains. You want to reshore production? You still need Chinese materials. You want to build domestic processing facilities? That takes a decade and billions in subsidized investment, and they can undercut your prices before you reach scale. Every option you have leads back to the same place. Manage dependence that looks voluntary but isn't. This is economic architecture at its absolute finest. It's not about military force. It's not about sanctions or embargoes. It's about creating a system where the rational individual choice leads to collective strategic vulnerability. And the beautiful thing about this system, from China's perspective, is that it's self-reinforcing. The more dependent you become, the more expensive it is to change. The longer you wait, the deeper the integration. And the deeper the integration, the more painful any disruption becomes. Which makes disruption itself a tool. You don't have to cut anyone off. You just have to make them aware that you could. That possibility changes everything. It changes behavior. It changes negotiations. It changes what people are willing to say and do when their supply chains hang in the balance. And we're seeing this play out right now in real time across every emerging technology sector. Look at the electric vehicle transition that every politician promises. America wants to lead it. Every major automaker has committed billions to it. The government is subsidizing it with your tax dollars. But where do the batteries come from? China controls over 70% of global battery production. Where do the battery materials get processed? China refines over 90% of the world's cobalt, over 70% of lithium, over 90% of graphite. You can mine these materials elsewhere. You can even process them elsewhere eventually. But right now, today, if you want to build electric vehicles at scale, if you want to hit the targets politicians keep announcing, your supply chain flows through China, which means China has influence over the pace of transition, the economics of transition, and who succeeds in the transition. That's strategic leverage over the future. Or look at renewable energy and the green transition. Solar panels everywhere. America wants energy independence. It wants to reduce carbon emissions. It invests billions in solar subsidies. But China produces over 80% of the world's solar panels. It controls the polysilicon supply chain. It dominates the manufacturing equipment. You can put tariffs on Chinese panels. Companies will adjust. They'll assemble panels in Vietnam or Malaysia or Mexico. But the cells, the wafers, the key components, they still trace back to China. You haven't eliminated the dependence. You've just made it less visible and therefore less politically urgent. And less visible dependencies are more dangerous because people stop worrying about them until it's too late. Remember what Bezos said about fragile systems? We're living inside one. Every day. And most people have no idea. So here's the real question America hasn't answered yet, the question that keeps strategists up at night. Can you rebuild supply chains without crashing your own economy? Because here's the brutal problem. The current system works. It's efficient. It's cheap. It delivers products to American consumers at prices they can afford. Any disruption to that system shows up immediately as inflation, as shortages, as empty shelves, as angry voters asking why things cost more and why they can't get what they need when they need it. Building alternative supply chains takes time, years, sometimes decades. It takes massive investment. It takes accepting significantly higher costs while new systems come online and scale up. And it requires coordination between government and business at a level that America hasn't achieved since World War II. So you're asking people to accept pain now for security later. That's a devastating sell politically. Which means the window for action keeps narrowing while the dependence keeps deepening. And China is counting on exactly that. And China knows this. They're not sitting still waiting for America to catch up. They're moving deeper into higher value chains. They're expanding control over emerging technologies. Artificial intelligence hardware, quantum computing components, biotechnology equipment. They're investing in the research, the talent, the infrastructure. They're creating the next generation of dependencies before anyone realizes they're strategic. Because that's the pattern. By the time something is obviously critical, by the time it makes headlines and gets congressional hearings, it's too late to easily build alternatives. The trap is already built. You're already inside it. But here's what makes this truly unsettling. What should make every American pay attention? China's next move won't target factories. It will target what Americans are allowed to buy next. Think carefully about that. The leverage isn't just about current products on shelves today. It's about future products. The technologies that haven't been deployed yet. The innovations that are still in laboratories. The standards that haven't been set. The infrastructure that hasn't been built. Whoever controls the supply chains for emerging technologies controls which innovations reach scale. They control which companies succeed. They control which countries lead the next economic era. And right now, at this moment, that position belongs to China in more sectors than most Americans realize or want to admit. Electric vehicles, renewable energy, advanced manufacturing, artificial intelligence hardware, biotechnology equipment, next-generation telecommunications, advanced materials. These aren't separate industries. They're the foundation of 21st century economic power and national security. And in every single one, China has positioned itself as the indispensable node in the supply chain. Not the only node. That would be too obvious and too vulnerable. But the critical node. The one that's hardest to replace. The one that gives them a seat at every important negotiating table. The one that gives them veto power over the future. So that's where we are. Not in a crisis yet, but in a system designed to produce one. And here's what keeps policymakers up at night when they're honest. The choice isn't between easy and hard anymore. It's between expensive now or catastrophic later. Between accepting inflation your voters can see and feel every day, or accepting dependence they can't see until it's activated. between paying more at the checkout line or losing control of your economic destiny. And China is betting America won't choose the pain. Because democracies don't plan in decades, they plan in election cycles, they plan in quarterly earnings, they plan in news cycles that last 3 days before the next crisis grabs attention. And that 4-year thinking, that short-term optimization, is exactly how you lose a 30-year game. When that reality fully hits, when Americans wake up one morning and realize the choices have already been made for them, the shock won't stay economic. It will become political. It will become social. And by then, the question won't be whether America can rebuild. The question will be whether it's still allowed to.